Our story begins in the small town of Briar Glen, a place hidden away in the folds of an old forest, where traditions run as deep as the roots of the ancient trees surrounding it. This year, as every year, the townspeople of Briar Glen prepare for the ritual that sets them apart from everywhere else, the 24-hour silence. No one seems to know precisely how the ritual started. Some say it's been around for centuries, while others insist it began during a time of war, a last-ditch attempt to hide the town's presence from marauding invaders. There are even rumors that silence itself is a kind of sacrifice, appeasing something ancient and unknown that demands their yearly obedience. And yet, everyone follows the rule, even though few are old enough to remember why it came about. Every year, on the winter solstice, Briar Glen falls into a hush so complete that even the animals seem to respect it. For most of his life, Elias Green has accepted this ritual like everyone else. Now 21, he's lived through countless silent days, spending them in hushed reverence, afraid of the consequences of making even the slightest sound. Still, a nagging feeling has gnawed at him for as long as he can remember. He's never been able to shake the sensation that there's something wrong with the silence, that it's not merely tradition but a thin wall between the people of Briar Glen and something lurking just beyond their understanding. His friends have dismissed his fears, and his family has brushed him off. But Elias knows what he's felt. He can't explain it, but he's felt it. On the night before this year's silence, Elias paces his room, looking out into the thickening darkness. People are rushing around town, reinforcing their windows, placing protective talismans at their doors, and fastening thick, hand-woven blankets over the windows to block out every glimpse of the outside. The air is thick with anticipation, and the tension is palpable, crackling just beneath the surface of every interaction. As Elias heads to the local shop to buy a few last-minute supplies, he catches the town's mood. It's not just respect for tradition, it's genuine fear. Outside, the main street feels different tonight. There's an unusual number of candles burning in windows, casting eerie, flickering light across the empty sidewalks. Shops close early, and even the bar at the end of the block has pulled its shutters tight. People walk quickly, heads down, only glancing up to exchange brief, almost conspiratorial looks with their neighbors. Elias can't help but notice the expressions on their faces: worry, dread, resignation. He recognizes that they're preparing, but it's not like any other year. There's a tension in the air that feels darker, as if some unspoken fear has crept into the silence tradition this time. Elias's curiosity burns brighter than ever this year. He's heard all the stories, of course. The old tales warn of terrible things, souls who dared to speak and were taken, the specters that walk Briar Glen streets on that single day, looking for anyone who dares to break the peace. Parents have always used it as a cautionary tale to scare their children into behaving, but Elias has grown suspicious that there's something more to it. He's begun to wonder if the silence isn't a tradition of protection, but more a method of control. The way the adults speak about it, how their eyes glaze over with almost religious reverence, it's unsettling. To pass the time, he'd spent days researching the ritual in the town's meager library, going through old records, letters, and diaries of townspeople who have long since passed. But there was precious little information. Most records of the silent day are brief and vague, mentioning the tradition but never explaining its origins in detail. It's almost as though the townsfolk had been too afraid to write about it, as though words themselves were enough to trigger whatever punishment they so feared. Still, the silence isn't the only thing troubling Elias. For the past few weeks, he's noticed strange marks scratched into the doors of certain houses, his own included. At first, he thought it might be some bored kids playing pranks, but the markings are oddly deliberate, repetitive crosses etched deeply into the wood, surrounded by faint circles. Elias had asked his father about it, but his dad only glanced at him, muttered, "It's nothing," and refused to say more. His mother was no help either, quickly changing the subject whenever he brought it up. And it wasn't just the marks. In the days leading up to the silence, he'd begun seeing strange figures around town, shadows that seemed too large to belong to any ordinary person, standing at odd angles or slipping between trees at the edge of his vision. Once, just 2 nights ago, he'd seen a tall, thin figure standing in the street outside his house, motionless, watching his window. He'd blinked, and it was gone. His pulse still races when he thinks about it, the way it seemed almost to fade rather than walk away. Tomorrow, when the silence begins, Elias is supposed to stay inside with his family, locked away in their house with the windows sealed and their voices stilled. But his curiosity is like an itch he can't scratch, gnawing away at him. He's thought about breaking the rule, just this once. Just to see if anything happens. Just to prove that all the fear is unwarranted, that the townsfolk are too frightened to think clearly. After all, he's an adult now, and if he's going to live here his whole life, he deserves to know the truth, right? The rumors swirl in his mind, layering doubt over doubt. There's the one about the old man who supposedly whispered to his wife during the silence when Elias was just a boy. By morning, his house had been found empty, and the doors left wide open, a black smear marking the threshold as though something had been dragged across it. His house has been empty ever since, boarded up and abandoned, as though the town itself was afraid of what lay inside. Then there's the story of Marianne, who supposedly tried to leave town the night before a silence, convinced that she could escape whatever haunted it. She made it a mile down the forest road before her abandoned car was found. No one has seen her since. As Elias sits by his window, watching the last few people lock up for the night, he wonders if he'll have the courage to go through with it. Would he really dare to make a sound? To test the boundaries of his town's most sacred rule? Part of him knows he'd be risking his own safety, maybe even his life, but the curiosity is becoming unbearable. It's as though something is whispering in his ear, urging him to defy the silence. That night, as he lies in bed, Elias dreams of dark figures, faces he doesn't recognize but feels he should. They're standing at his bedside, silent, staring down at him with expressions that seem both accusing and pitying. He wants to ask them who they are, why they're here, but when he opens his mouth, no sound comes out. Only silence surrounds him, pressing in, thick and suffocating. The dream unsettles him, and he wakes in a cold sweat, more determined than ever to see what lies beyond the silence. At the stroke of midnight, the silence begins. It's as if the world itself holds its breath. Even the ticking of the old grandfather clock in Elias's house feels muted, as though it knows to keep quiet. The usual background hum of life fades into nothing, leaving a stillness so complete it's nearly suffocating. Elias has experienced this ritual countless times, but tonight feels different. Perhaps it's because of the rumors gnawing at him, the stories he's heard about those who vanished without a trace after daring to defy the town's silence. Or maybe it's the tension in the air that's only grown stronger over the last few weeks, settling over Briar Glen like a heavy mist. For a moment, he considers staying safe inside, just following the rules. But something in him rebels at the thought, and he feels an inexplicable urge to see for himself what happens during this hush, to know what it is his family and neighbors are so afraid of. Moving as quietly as he can, he edges toward the front window, pulling back the thick fabric his parents had draped over it to block out any view of the outside world. He inches it just enough to peer through a narrow gap, careful to keep his breathing steady, shallow. The street outside is barely visible in the moonlight, cast in shades of silver and shadow. Every house is dark, every window covered, as if each home has been abandoned overnight. His town, looks like a ghost town, strange and unfamiliar, yet so intimately known. As his eyes adjust, Elias realizes the silence is unnatural, heavier than he remembers. Even his own heartbeat feels too loud, a hammering reminder of his disobedience. He pulls his gaze from the empty street, willing himself to calm down, to focus on staying as still and quiet as possible. But then he notices something strange, something he hadn't seen before. There are faint, moving shadows on the far end of the street, figures that seem to hover just outside the reach of the moonlight, their movements slow and methodical. He squints, trying to make sense of them, but every time he thinks he has, they seem to melt back into the dark. Elias can't shake the feeling that he's being watched, that these figures are aware of his gaze. He recoils, letting the fabric fall back over the window, his pulse racing. Who, or what, are they? He fights the urge to turn on a light or call out, reminding himself that he must keep quiet. His curiosity surges, but so does the realization that something is terribly wrong with this silence. The house feels emptier, too, colder somehow. His parents are in their room down the hall, no doubt lying awake just like he is, terrified to make a single sound. The quiet presses against him, thick and almost suffocating, and Elias finds himself longing for any noise, any sign of life. The faintest sound would break the oppressive weight of this hush. But he knows better. He creeps back to his window, lifting the edge of the fabric once more. The shadows on the street have multiplied, and he can make out shapes now, dark, humanoid figures, moving in slow, measured steps. They don't seem to belong to anyone he recognizes, and as they pass each house, Elias notices that they pause briefly at each door, lingering as though they're listening. He stifles a gasp, clutching the edge of the curtain tightly. The figures seem to be checking each house, as if they're looking for something or someone who has broken the silence. Across the street, he spots movement. A woman, her face vaguely familiar, is standing at her front door, hands clamped over her mouth as she tries to suppress panicked, shallow breaths. He recognizes her now, Mrs. Tilly, a widow who lives alone and whose nerves always seem on edge. Her eyes dart around frantically, wide with fear as she attempts to calm herself. But in her panicked state, her breathing is too loud, too desperate. Elias can almost feel her struggle, the way she fights to control herself, but each breath seems to slip through her fingers like sand, louder and louder. Then, in the stillness, a slight sound escapes her, a quiet, involuntary whimper. It's barely audible, a noise so small that, on any other night, it would go unnoticed. But tonight, in the oppressive silence, it's deafening. Elias's breath catches, and he watches in horror as the shadows on the street pause, their heads turning sharply toward her house. Mrs. Tilly seems to realize her mistake, her hands flying up to cover her mouth tighter, but it's too late. The figures begin moving toward her door, silent and swift, like predators honing in on their prey. He wants to look away, to unsee the sight unfolding before him, but he can't. He's frozen in place, his eyes fixed on the woman across the street as she backs away from the door in terror, retreating into the shadows of her house. The figures reach her front step, and Elias watches as they gather, standing in a semicircle, eerily still. The door is slightly ajar now, though he's certain she hadn't opened it. It almost looks like the figures themselves had beckoned it open. In the next moment, she's gone. One moment, she's there, and then, in the blink of an eye, the door swings shut, leaving only silence in its wake. No sign of struggle, no flash of movement, just emptiness. The street looks the same as before, as if nothing out of the ordinary has happened. Elias stands by the window, Unable to process what he's just seen, his skin crawling with the realization that she's gone without a trace, swallowed up by the silence. A chill settles over him, icy and persistent. He suddenly understands, with horrifying clarity, why the townsfolk never break the silence. Those who do don't simply vanish, they're taken. Taken by something that doesn't belong to the town, something that comes to Briar Glen on this night alone, summoned by sound. Mrs. Tilly's disappearance leaves him breathless, his fingers trembling as he lets the curtain drop back into place. As the hours creep by, Elias becomes painfully aware of every sound he almost makes, a floorboard that might creak if he shifts his weight, the rustle of his clothing if he so much as moves his arm. Every sound he could potentially make feels like a threat, an invitation to whatever lurks outside. It's a mental battle just to keep his breathing steady, to keep the fear from clawing its way out in a gasp or a sob. He wonders how he ever endured this night as a child, oblivious to the terror it truly holds. Time feels warped, stretched out and distorted. The longer he remains silent, the more he notices things he'd never seen before, the slight movement of shadows under his door, the faintest trace of whispers, too soft to understand, drifting through the walls like a chilling lullaby. He feels watched, the gaze coming from all directions, heavy and unyielding. Then, just before dawn, he glimpses another shadow outside his window, a lone figure this time, standing in the middle of the street, unmoving. It's not like the other figures he's seen throughout the night. This one is different, too tall, its form almost indistinct, as though it's partially hidden by the darkness itself. And though he can't see its face, Elias knows it's looking straight at his window, straight at him. The figure raises a single finger to its lips, a clear gesture of silence. The message is unmistakable, a final warning not to break the vow of quiet. Elias steps back, a fresh wave of terror washing over him. He feels the weight of the ritual pressing down, more oppressive than ever, as though the very air is thick with the unspoken consequence of breaking it. And just like that, he understands. The silence isn't a choice, it's a price. It's the only thing keeping these figures, these shadows, at bay. As the hours creep by in suffocating silence, Elias's mind starts to spiral, haunted by the memory of Mrs. Tilly's disappearance and the shadowy figures that have lurked outside. He knows he should try to rest, but he can't shake the feeling that he's being watched, that something is closing in on him the longer he resists the silence ritual's grip. In his desperate search for answers, Elias remembers the attic. He overheard his father once mutter about something hidden up there, something that had been left by the previous occupants who had abruptly moved away decades ago without a word. His father had said it was just old junk, things best left undisturbed. But if there's anything up there that might explain what he just witnessed, Elias is willing to risk it. Steeling himself, he makes his way to the attic, stepping lightly and careful not to make a sound. The old ladder creaks under his weight, and he pauses, heart pounding, waiting for the silence to consume the noise. Once he reaches the top, he searches through the dusty boxes and cobweb-laden corners, his flashlight beam sweeping across forgotten relics. After a few tense minutes, his light catches something odd, a small, weathered journal, its leather cover cracked and worn with age. The journal feels heavy in his hands, filled with an ominous energy. As he flips it open, he realizes it's more than just a collection of old memories. It's a record left behind by someone who tried to defy the silence. The first few pages are scrawled with shaky handwriting, their ink faded but legible. Underscore to whoever finds this, please, heed my words and don't make the same mistake I did. I thought it was just superstition, a meaningless ritual forced on us by fear. But I was wrong. I broke the silence, and now I can't escape it. Underscore. Elias feels a chill prickling at the back of his neck, but he reads on, his eyes darting over the frantic, desperate script. The entries detail the thoughts of a man named Alton Reed, who had grown up in Briar Glen and had harbored a deep suspicion of the ritual. Alton had dismissed it as folklore, something created to keep children from causing a ruckus for one night each year. One year, he decided to test the limits, to prove it was all just a baseless tradition. According to the diary, he'd whispered a single word just after midnight. The consequences had been immediate. The entries grew more panicked as Alton described strange events that began to unfold around him. Shadows that lingered just out of sight, voices that called his name in the dead of night, strange figures that seemed to watch him from the edges of his vision. And then, he mentions someone he calls the Collector. The Collector, he writes, is not of this world. It is the enforcer of the silence. It wears a shape that's neither man nor shadow, but something in between. It finds those who dare to break the vow and ensures they never break it again. I tried to run, tried to hide, but the Collector found me. Once you've drawn its gaze, there's no escape. It watches and waits, silent as the grave. The Collector is patient. It will always come for those who break the silence. Elias's throat tightens as he reads. The figure he'd seen on the street, the one who had seemed to stare directly into his window, raising a finger to its lips, had that been the Collector? He feels sick, his skin crawling as he imagines a being that exists solely to enforce the silence ritual, taking those who falter in its oppressive quiet. The entries in the journal grow more scattered and increasingly unhinged as Alton realizes he's been marked. He describes hearing footsteps outside his door every night, the scraping of nails against the wood as the Collector waited, patient and persistent. Alton had tried to escape, but he could feel its presence wherever he went. The final entries are nearly illegible, scrawled with a frantic, trembling hand. I don't know how much time I have left. I hear it outside again, closer every night. It knows I'm here, hiding, but it's playing with me, letting the silence drive me mad. They say the Collector doesn't leave anything behind. When it comes for you, you're erased from the town, from memory, as if you never existed. That's the true price of breaking the silence. You lose yourself to it, body and soul. The last page is smeared, the ink trailing off as if Alton's hand had been seized mid-sentence. Elias shudders, a cold dread settling deep in his bones. Alton Reed was never someone he'd heard about growing up. If he disappeared, he'd been erased, just as he'd warned. No one in Briar Glen speaks his name or remembers he ever existed. Elias wonders how many others the Collector has taken, people whose names and faces are lost, wiped from memory because they dared to break the silence. And then he notices something. The journal is addressed to him. On the last page, in bolder, fresher ink, the words read, _Elias, you've already drawn its attention. A soft creak echoes through the house, pulling him back to the present. His blood runs cold. It sounded like it came from downstairs, the slow, deliberate shift of weight on an old floorboard. He freezes, his heart pounding so loudly he's sure it can be heard, though he's paralyzed by the knowledge that any sound he makes could be the end of him. Another creak follows, closer this time, and he knows he isn't alone. Suddenly, he hears a faint whisper, so quiet he almost thinks he imagined it. It's his name, drawn out in a low, taunting murmur that slithers through the silence. His breath hitches, and he grips the journal tighter, his mind racing. He'd only been curious, only asked a few questions, dared to pull back the curtain, but somehow, that had been enough. The Collector's gaze is on him now. Elias strains his ears, desperate to hear any indication of where the sound is coming from. But the silence remains, thick and oppressive, almost mocking in its stillness. He moves as quietly as possible, inching back toward the trapdoor, determined to retreat to his room. Maybe if he can make it through the night, the ritual will end and he'll be safe again. But just as he reaches the trapdoor, he hears it, a slow, scraping sound, as though fingernails were trailing along the walls just outside the attic. He holds his breath, every muscle tensed, afraid to even swallow. He can feel its presence now, a dark, heavy pressure that settles over him, filling the air with the scent of damp earth and decay. He realizes he's been marked in some way, a target branded by his curiosity. Just as Alton had warned, once you catch the collector's attention, it never lets go. The whispering grows louder, though the words are still indistinct, a twisted lullaby echoing through the silence. Elias feels a presence at his back, the weight of eyes burning into him, and he knows if he turns around, he'll see something he can't unsee, something that will drive him mad. In a final, desperate attempt to escape, he drops to his knees, pressing his hands over his ears and closing his eyes. He tries to shut it out, to force his mind to go blank, to pretend he's safe in his room, that this nightmarish ritual has ended. But the whispers slip through his hands, seeping into his mind like poison. And then, just as he's about to break, about to scream, the sounds stop. The silence returns, thicker and darker than before, filling the space like a living thing. Elias opens his eyes, only to find himself alone in the attic. The air is heavy, charged with a lingering sense of dread, but there's no sign of the collector. The only evidence of its presence is a faint, smoky scent in the air, and a single fingerprint on the attic door, a dark smudge, almost like ash. Shaken, he forces himself back down to his room, his mind reeling. Had it all been his imagination? A trick of the silence? Or had he truly drawn the gaze of something beyond this world? As he slips under the covers, he can't shake the feeling that he's still being watched, that the collector is still out there, waiting. Just as he closes his eyes, hoping for sleep, he hears it, a soft, faint click from his closet, like the sound of a door slowly creaking open. As dawn approaches, Elias is gripped by a chilling unease that won't let him rest. Every nerve in his body feels tightly wound, as though even the slightest movement will unravel something dark that lurks just out of sight. He keeps replaying the events of the night, the faint creak of the attic floorboard beneath his feet, the sense of being watched, the faint but undeniable sensation that something had been close enough to hear him, to mark him. The silence had felt alive, almost predatory, reacting to the tiniest disturbance with a kind of malice he couldn't fully comprehend. Still shaken, he creeps downstairs, moving with painstaking caution. He places each foot carefully, barely daring to breathe, until he reaches the kitchen. He's just started to pour himself a glass of water when his elbow brushes against a stray spoon on the counter, causing it to shift and make the faintest clink. The sound slices through the silence like a knife. Elias freezes, his heart thudding loudly in his chest, every muscle tense. He listens, his ears straining to pick up even the slightest response. The house is quiet, but it doesn't feel empty. He feels watched, as though the very walls have eyes. Minutes pass, stretching on endlessly, but nothing happens. Trying to calm himself, he takes a few steps back from the counter. He's careful now, placing his glass down slowly, cautiously stepping away from anything that might betray his presence with the tiniest sound. His paranoia grows with each passing second, the heavy silence pressing down on him like a weight. He swears he sees movement in the shadows, flickers just at the edge of his vision, but each time he looks, nothing's there. From his window, he notices his neighbors. They're walking in rigid, almost mechanical movements, glancing around with darting, anxious eyes. Mrs. Hanson, who usually greets everyone with a loud, cheerful good morning at the break of dawn, stands silently on her porch, her face pale and drawn. She's clutching the front of her shirt as though it might hold her together. Across the street, Mr. Gray, who prides himself on tending to his lawn at first light, simply stands in his yard, staring at his house, as though he, too, is listening, waiting. It dawns on Elias with growing horror that maybe they're not just keeping silent, they're hiding. He begins to notice small, suspicious gestures, neighbors pressing their hands over their mouths, flinching at any small sound they accidentally make. Their eyes meet his through their windows with an almost desperate intensity before they quickly look away. Unable to shake the feeling that something sinister is circling him, Elias goes back upstairs. He notices something strange on his bedroom floor, a piece of folded paper that hadn't been there before. His heart races as he picks it up, half expecting it to burn his fingers. The note is handwritten, the letters slightly smudged but unmistakably deliberate. _ leave town before the silence ends. You've already broken the rule. _ His stomach twists, nausea creeping in as he reads the last line. _ The floorboard creaked at 3:37 a.m. _ The exact time he'd stepped onto the attic floor. The precision terrifies him. Whoever left the note not only heard him but had been watching, aware of his every move. His fingers tremble as he clutches the paper, his mind racing with questions. How could they know the exact moment he made a sound? Was it possible someone was keeping watch over the entire town, listening for anyone who dared to disturb the silence? Or was it something more otherworldly, something that knew every sound in the silence like a predator tracking its prey? Paranoia claws at him as he tries to understand the implications. He begins to feel like he's being surveilled from all directions, that the walls have ears. The room feels smaller, as though closing in on him, squeezing out every trace of warmth and familiarity. He half expects to see eyes staring out at him from the shadows, waiting for him to slip up again. Every sound his house makes, the ticking of the clock, the hum of the fridge, feels amplified, as though each one risks inviting something terrible into his life. The idea of running crosses his mind, but the thought of venturing out into the town under these oppressive, silent rules terrifies him. What if leaving town only invites a worse fate? What if whatever watches him, this collector, follows him? The words in the journal had warned him that the collector didn't simply appear. It waited, patiently, silently, biding its time until it was sure its target was truly alone. The sun rises slowly, casting an eerie, muted light over the neighborhood. Though the day has begun, the silence endures. People shuffle through their routines like ghosts, their faces drawn and haunted, flinching at the slightest noise. Elias catches glimpses of other notes being discreetly exchanged between hands, passed between neighbors who appear just as anxious as he feels. Whatever they're doing, they're communicating without words, their eyes wide with unspoken terror. The day passes in a surreal haze. Elias stays locked inside his house, too afraid to make another sound, his movements cautious and deliberate. Every creak of the floor, every rustle of fabric, sets his nerves alight. He begins to imagine that the air itself is listening, recording each tiny disturbance, biding its time until the silence is shattered. He reads and rereads the note, his mind fixated on the warning. How could he leave town in silence? Would that even save him, or has his fate been sealed the moment he stepped on that floorboard? Afternoon drifts into evening, and with it, a heavier sense of dread settles over the town. Darkness falls, and Elias tries to keep his lights dim, fearing that even illumination might betray his presence. As he peers out the window, he notices something strange, an unfamiliar figure in the street, cloaked in shadow, moving with an eerie stillness that makes the hairs on his arms rise. It pauses near each house, lingering just long enough to observe each home before moving on, slow and methodical. He recognizes the description from the journal, the collector. His blood turns cold as he realizes that, unlike his neighbors who have somehow managed to stay undetected, he has already slipped. His movements become more frantic, though he tries to stay as quiet as possible, desperately searching for a place to hide, to escape this being's notice. He closes his curtains, his breath shallow and silent, his body tense with dread. A faint knock echoes from his front door, so soft it might almost be imagined, but Elias knows it's real. It's a sound that feels heavy with intent, the kind of knock that isn't a request, but a command. He can't bring himself to answer, his body frozen, every instinct urging him to remain absolutely silent. But the knocking doesn't stop. It's patient, unhurried, just like the figure he saw on the street. Then he hears it, a whisper so faint he nearly misses it, but it's unmistakable. It's his own name, spoken in a low, haunting voice that sends chills down his spine. Elias. He claps a hand over his mouth, his mind racing. The note's warning screams in his mind, but it feels futile. The collector knows where he is, and it's only a matter of time. He realizes then that he's not alone. Glancing over his shoulder, he catches sight of his reflection in the darkened window. It's his own face, but his eyes seem different, hollow and distant, like the faces of his neighbors. Suddenly, he feels a crushing weight, as though his thoughts, his very presence, are being drowned in an ocean of silence. He realizes he's not just being watched, he's being consumed, pulled into something vast and dark, a force that feeds on the quiet. He remembers Alton's words, asterisk, once you've drawn its gaze, there's no escape. Asterisk. The knocking stops, but the silence thickens, pressing down on him from all sides. He wonders if he's already gone, if his existence is slipping away into the same void that claimed those before him. The last thing he sees before darkness overtakes him is the crumpled note lying on the floor, the final words he'll ever read etched in trembling ink. Underscore, leave before the silence takes you too. Underscore. But he knows, with a sinking certainty, that it's too late. Elias stumbles through his front door just as the last rays of sunlight slip below the horizon, casting his small town into shadow. His mind races with the events of the past days, the strange noises, the warnings, the glimpses of shadowy figures moving silently through the streets. Now, with his heart still pounding from the close call with the collector, he feels driven by an unshakable need for answers. He's spent years watching his neighbors prepare for the silence ritual, but no one has ever truly explained why it was necessary. Why a single broken rule could invite such terror. With a determination he hasn't felt before, Elias heads toward the oldest part of town, to a place that even the locals avoid after dark, the abandoned public library. Once grand, its halls have been empty for decades, rumored to hold secrets about the town that no one dared to unearth. He has a vague memory of exploring it as a child before it was closed off, sneaking in with his friends and coming across a locked door in the basement, reinforced with thick iron bars. Reaching the library, Elias cautiously tests the front door and finds it open. Dust motes swirl in the last shafts of light filtering through broken windows as he steps inside, his footsteps muffled by a layer of dust thick enough to absorb any sound. The vast silence feels almost oppressive, as though he's entering the belly of a great beast. He takes a deep breath and heads downstairs, his hand trailing along the crumbling walls, feeling the quiet grow heavier around him. When he reaches the basement, Elias's flashlight beam reveals the iron door, looking far more foreboding than he remembers. A set of symbols is etched into the metal, a series of interlocking circles, an ancient script that sends a shiver down his spine. With a quick glance over his shoulder, he forces himself to breathe, steadying his nerves as he gently tests the handle. It gives way with a creak, and he winces, freezing in place and listening for any response. But the silence around him is impenetrable. Inside, the air is thick and stale. His flashlight sweeps across the room, revealing shelves of ancient books, dusty relics, and strange artifacts scattered across tables. At the center of the room lies a large, round stone table engraved with symbols that match the ones on the iron door. Elias's eyes settle on a single large book lying open, its pages yellowed with age, and he feels drawn to it, as if it has waited centuries just for him. He flips through the fragile pages, his eyes scanning the archaic writing until a name catches his attention, the Devourer of Sound. The passage describes an ancient entity, one that was said to feed on the vibrations of sound itself, growing stronger with each morsel. His fingers tremble as he reads, piecing together the terrible truth of the silence ritual. Centuries ago, the townsfolk had discovered that their voices and daily noises had begun to attract the entity's attention. The Devourer would hover just at the edge of perception, lurking like a shadow, feeding on every sound. The townspeople found that their only hope of survival was complete, enforced silence. By creating an annual ritual of soundlessness, they could avoid feeding the entity directly, placating it with silence so it would remain dormant. The townspeople had believed the ritual was a form of protection, a barrier between them and the Devourer. But as Elias continues reading, he finds disturbing clues hidden in the margins, scrawled notes by previous readers who had started to question the ritual's true purpose. One entry in particular sends chills down his spine, _ it is not a ward but an offering. _ Elias's pulse quickens. According to these notes, each year of silence has not weakened the Devourer but strengthened it, providing it with a ritualistic feast of stillness that somehow nourished it, allowing it to grow even more powerful. The quiet wasn't a shield, it was a lure, a way to sustain and fortify the entity over time. With every year that passed, it absorbed the town's collective fear, the vigilance, the suppression of sound, evolving into something far more dangerous than it had ever been. The more he reads, the clearer it becomes. The Devourer is no longer satisfied with silence alone. Elias finds an entry dated 50 years ago, in a more recent handwriting, explaining that previous generations had noticed strange occurrences when the silence ended each year. People would go missing, seemingly plucked from their lives without a trace, only to have their names whispered in hushed tones. The Devourer was beginning to demand more than just silence, it wanted those who defied it. Elias's eyes dart around the room, suddenly feeling as though he is intruding on sacred ground. The weight of his discovery presses down on him. By following this ritual, by conditioning themselves to fear every sound, they had unwittingly created a self-fulfilling prophecy. The Devourer was growing, changing, gaining strength from the silence the town provided it, and it was only a matter of time before it became powerful enough to break free. Turning the page, he finds a drawing, ancient and faded, depicting a shadowy figure with elongated limbs and an eyeless face, standing among a crowd of townsfolk with mouths open in silent screams. Beneath the image, a final line reads, _ when silence no longer satisfies, it will come for us all. _ Just then, he hears a faint noise from behind him, a soft shuffling, like footsteps, but when he spins around, his flashlight reveals only darkness. His heart races, and he realizes that he may not be alone. The walls feel like they're pressing in on him, and he stifles the urge to make a sound, feeling a sudden, inexplicable terror at the thought of attracting attention. But it's too late. The silence he's disturbed has already marked him. Determined to escape, Elias backs out of the room, clutching the book to his chest, and makes his way toward the stairs. But as he steps into the library's main hall, he hears it, the faintest echo of a voice, a low, guttural whisper that seems to seep out of the very walls. It calls his name, stretching each syllable in a voice that is both familiar and horrifying. Shaking, he realizes that he's hearing the voice of every person who has ever disappeared on Silence Night. The whispers overlap, a chorus of lost voices that seems to pulse and breathe, filling the air with an oppressive weight. It dawns on him with a sickening clarity that the Devourer isn't just an entity, it's a collection, an amalgamation of every sound, every life it's claimed over centuries. Desperation claws at him, and he bolts toward the exit. But as he reaches the front doors, they slam shut, trapping him inside the building. The whispers grow louder, taking on a sinister harmony that seems to vibrate through his bones. Elias stumbles backward, his vision blurring as he sees shadows coalesce into vaguely human forms around him. He remembers the warning in the journal, the mention of the collector, the one who comes to gather those who break the silence. And now, he understands, the collector isn't a person or even a creature, it's an aspect of the Devourer itself, a piece that manifests to claim anyone who dares defy its rule. Elias retreats into a corner, clutching the book as though it can shield him, as though knowing the truth will somehow protect him. But he knows it's futile. The whispers grow louder, closing in on him, the darkness thickening until it feels like he's drowning in it. Faces form within the shadows, hollow, eyeless faces that seem to watch him with an insatiable hunger. In his final moments, Elias realizes that the Devourer's prison was never meant to protect the town, it was a pact, an agreement to give it what it wanted in exchange for temporary peace. And now, after centuries of feeding and growing stronger, it is ready to break free. The last thing he hears before everything goes black is a single, whispered phrase, breathed into his ear in a voice that seems to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Underscore the silence is broken. Underscore. And with those words, the entire town awakens to the sound of a deep, guttural roar that shatters the stillness of the night, echoing across the streets as the Devourer rises, no longer confined by the silence it once fed upon. The ritual has failed, the pact broken, and the Devourer is finally free. The final night of silence approaches like a storm cloud, darkening the horizon with an intensity that seems almost unnatural. Elias's heart is racing as he darts through the streets of the town, each step filled with a mounting dread. His discovery in the library has left him shaken to the core, the Devourer, a malevolent entity born from the very silence that the town has been forced to uphold for centuries, has grown stronger, fed by the suffocating quiet each year. The ritual wasn't keeping it at bay, it was nurturing it, and now it is poised to break free. Elias feels like a madman, desperate to warn anyone who will listen, but as the hours tick down, he knows that time is running out. The streets are eerily empty. The usual clamor of the town, the chatter of neighbors, the distant hum of late-night activities, are all replaced with the suffocating hush that has settled over the place like a blanket. Elias feels as though the silence itself is watching him, waiting, like the dark before a storm. He runs past homes, peering into windows to see the townsfolk, every single one of them, in perfect, unnerving stillness. Their faces, frozen in expressionless masks, are dimly illuminated by the weak glow of candles flickering within. It is as though the town has become a graveyard of living statues, all dutifully observing the rule, as if to break it would bring some terrible consequence. And yet, none of them seem aware of the truth Elias has uncovered. As he races toward the town square, the place where the town leaders traditionally gather to enforce the silence, a horrible realization strikes him. They know. The leaders know. The silence is not for protection, it is for power. He reaches the center of the square, where the town's oldest residents gather every year, their eyes gleaming with a strange satisfaction. They are not simply obeying the silence, Elias realizes, they are orchestrating it. The elders have been keeping the truth hidden for generations, feeding the devourer with sacrifices, the missing townsfolk who disappear each year under the guise of accidents or misfortune. Those who dare break the silence? They're taken, yes, but only after their fate is sealed by the town leaders themselves, who allow the entity to feast on them in exchange for their own safety. The silence is their currency, and they have been paying it for centuries. Elias is horrified as the town leaders exchange glances, their eyes gleaming with the same unholy knowledge. They are the true culprits, the puppet masters, and he is the first to realize that the whole town, in its blind obedience to the ritual, has been complicit. His breath catches in his throat as he races forward, his pulse pounding in his ears. He cannot let this go on any longer. He has to act. The silence is about to end. It's almost midnight. Elias runs to the center of the square, standing at the foot of the ancient stone monument that marks the heart of the town. The townsfolk stand motionless, unblinking, their faces locked in eerie calm, as though the entire town is holding its breath. He has to do something, anything, to stop this madness. The devourer is no longer a legend or a myth. It is real. It is coming, and it has grown too powerful to be stopped by mere silence. In a frantic fit of desperation, Elias begins to shout. His voice breaks the silence, the sound of it so jarring that it feels like a tangible thing, slicing through the oppressive quiet. You've been lying to us. He screams, his voice hoarse, his hands shaking with the effort. The silence was never to protect us. It was to feed it. To keep it alive. You've been sacrificing us all, every year. He doesn't care who hears him anymore. He doesn't care if the town leaders see him as a madman or if the entity hears his cries. He needs to make as much noise as possible. He pounds on the stone monument, his fists striking the cold granite, his cries of terror echoing down the streets. He yells, screams, desperate for the truth to be heard. He does everything in his power to shatter the silence, to undo the ritual before it's too late. Then it happens. The ground begins to shake, as though the earth itself is reacting to the noise, to his defiance. The silence fractures like glass, the stillness splitting open with a deep, unnatural rumble. And then, a sound, the sound rises up from the depths of the earth, a low, guttural growl that rips through the air like a beast's roar. The earth trembles beneath his feet as if something vast and powerful is awakening, and Elias is suddenly aware of the truth he's been avoiding. The devourer has been fed, and it is now rising, stronger than anyone could have anticipated. As the last stroke of midnight strikes, the world around him shudders and buckles. Elias falls to his knees as the ground cracks open, and from the depths of the earth, an enormous shadow emerges. It is a mass of swirling darkness, a shape that is simultaneously everywhere and nowhere, stretching and shifting with 1,000 unseen limbs. The air grows thick, suffocating, and Elias can taste the raw, metallic edge of terror in the back of his throat. He tries to run, but his legs feel like lead, his body paralyzed by the overwhelming presence of the devourer, which looms above him now, its formless shape coalescing into something both familiar and nightmarish. Its voice echoes through his mind, not spoken but felt, a vibration that sears through his skull, as though every sound he's ever made, every noise that has ever been uttered in the town, is being absorbed into its very being. And then it speaks, or rather whispers, in a voice that is far too deep, too ancient to comprehend. You cannot escape. Elias's blood runs cold as he realizes that the entity isn't just an outsider. It isn't some otherworldly force. It is the town itself. A collective, an amalgamation of every sound, every whisper, every scream and cry that has ever been silenced over centuries. The ritual didn't trap it, it created it. The silence was never meant to protect the people. It was meant to empower the entity, feeding it for generations until it could rise and claim the town as its own. The roar of the devourer fills the air, and Elias feels himself being pulled toward it, his very existence being devoured by its presence. In that moment, he understands the ultimate twist. The town has always been a vessel, and the townsfolk, all of them, are just its first course. As Elias's vision fades to black, he hears one final, deafening roar, and in the last flicker of consciousness, he realizes that the silence was never truly broken. It's just begun.